Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what promises to be a very informative session. My name is Shalini Natraj, and I'm on the board of Asylum Access, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. First, we will have Emily Arnold-Fernández, who is the president and CEO of Asylum Access. She's an accomplished, award-winning human rights lawyer who has been involved with refugee rights since 2002. She founded Asylum Access in 2005 to transform refugee rights from paper promises to on-the-ground reality. Next, we have Alejandra Marcias, who is the executive director of Asylum Access Mexico. She's one of the top experts in refugee law in Mexico and sits on the Citizens Council of the National Institute for Migration, giving her and Asylum Access Mexico substantial powers of government oversight and advocacy. Asylum Access Mexico is the largest provider of legal aid to refugees in Mexico. And then we have Daniel Berlin, who is the Deputy Director of Asylum Access Mexico. Also a human rights attorney, Daniel has more than a decade of experience serving clients in the US, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. With that, I'll hand it over to Emily to kick us off.
Thanks, Shalini, and welcome to everyone. I'm really glad to see you all here and really appreciate that you're taking the time to join us and learn a little bit more about the US-Mexico border and issues for refugees. I wanted to start, though, by telling you a little bit about Asylum Access as a global organization or family of organizations. And I thought I would start by talking about why Asylum Access exists. Shalini mentioned that I got my start on refugee human rights issues in 2002. And that happened when I was working in Egypt with refugees there. So people coming from all over Africa and beyond, seeking safety in Egypt. And I met a young man who I'll call Geno. For his privacy, I've changed the name. Geno was a refugee. He was 20 years old when I met him, and he had been a refugee from the time he was 10. So he'd spent half of his life unable to remain in his country. And in Egypt, where I met him, Geno wasn't allowed to go to school. He wasn't allowed to work. He wasn't allowed to take most of the steps that you and I would think of as necessary to rebuild a life, to get on with a normal life. And yet when I met him, he was always busy. He had 3 different volunteer jobs, I learned. So jobs that he was doing without even getting paid for them. And I asked him, what motivates you to do all of this? But, I was sure I knew the answer. I thought, okay, he's going to tell me that, he's been here for a long time. He knows how things work. He has been helped by other people. And so now he's giving back. And he was a very kind and caring person who was always ready to help someone. But Geno looked me in the eye and said, the reason I'm doing this is because someday I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to be someplace where they let me work. And I'm going to need a resume. So I'm doing these 3 jobs to build my resume. Now, needless to say, I was blown away. Was not expecting that answer. And it was one of many eye-opening moments about the problems that refugees face, not just the problems that cause them to leave home, but the problems they face when they land somewhere, when they arrive somewhere. And there are millions of Genos all over the world, mostly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so when Asylum Access started, we started to respond to the situation that Geno and millions of people like him face. We started because we saw that it was important for refugees not only to be able to reach physical safety, but to be able to rebuild their lives without barriers that kept them from taking all of those normal steps, going to school and getting a job and renting an apartment and opening a bank account. And so we started Asylum Access to fix this. And we approach this problem using 3 strategies. So the first is legal empowerment. And that's a big fancy term, but basically means helping people to navigate the system, navigate the rules as they exist. So helping people to figure out what permissions do they need, what documents do they need, how do they stand up for their rights, what do they do if they work for a month and then their employer refuses to pay them. And so we're working with refugee individuals, refugee families, and refugee communities. So we help them to navigate the system as it exists. But as we just talked about, a lot of the time, the system has huge barriers that don't need to be there, that aren't good for anyone. And so we also use policy change. We work with governments and we advocate to governments to build a better system for people like Jeno. And we do this deeply in key exemplar countries. Mexico is one of them, and we'll hear more about Mexico today. And third, we engage globally with institutions that have the power to lead these kind of changes at a global scale. So asylum access can only be in a few countries directly. We also support other organizations in other countries. We share lessons, we share resources. But at the end of the day, there are organizations with much more power and much greater reach that have the potential to make these changes a reality everywhere that a refugee lives. And that's what we're seeking. And those institutions of power are institutions like the UN and the World Bank, and also donor governments like the US government, which we'll talk about more deeply today. So all of this work is important and meaningful, but I'll tell you, the thing that makes the biggest difference to me, the thing that's the most meaningful to me, is when I learn about stories of the people that Asylum Access has helped. People like Hector. He came into Asylum Access Mexico and told us his story. He lived in Honduras. His home was in Honduras, and he and his brother were targeted by members of the M18 gang. So he was 28 years old. He and his brother were trying to go about their daily lives, and M18 came after him. In particular, they followed him and his brother after they left work one day, and Hector's brother distracted the gang so that Hector could get away. His brother died, and Hector knew that he had to leave if he wanted to survive. And so he fled, seeking to reach the United States to apply for asylum. And he did actually get here to the US, but he was sent back to Mexico while his asylum claim was pending as part of the Trump administration's policies, what we call the MPP. So Hector's US asylum application moved forward. He showed up for court in the US when he needed to, but he lived very far away from the one point of entry at the border that he could cross to go to his asylum hearings. And so his very last immigration hearing, he was an hour late due to problems in transportation, problems in getting to the port of entry. And so he was refused entry to the US. He was not allowed to enter the US and make his case to the judge and explain why he was late. And he received no more information on his case. So seeking asylum in the US was no longer an option because of the way that these policies affected him. Fortunately, he connected with our lawyers in Tijuana, and we were able to help Hector apply for asylum in Mexico. And I'm super excited to share that on January 18th, so just 6 weeks ago, he received refugee status. He's currently working in a factory and rebuilding his life in Tijuana. And we're thrilled that we were able to play a part in this difficult journey and in helping him find a place where he can start to rebuild. So with that, I'm going to invite Ale and Dan to join me for our discussion as we dive into Mexico. And so I'd like to pose the first question to Ale. And I'll pose a set of questions and then we'll take Q&A from the audience. But Ale, before we talk about the US and the Biden administration's new policies, their changes to what Trump did previously, I'd love for you to just start by giving us a little background. Tell us about Asylum Access Mexico, how your team is supporting refugees and people seeking asylum, and we'll start there.
Sí, gracias, Emily. Buenas tardes a todas y a todas las personas que nos acompañan. Es un gusto para mí estar con ustedes y compartir el trabajo de la organización en México. Pues En México estamos trabajando desde 2015 y como ya lo mencionaron, es el mayor proveedor de asistencia jurídica para las personas refugiadas en México. Actualmente tenemos 7 oficinas en todo el país. Nuestras oficinas están principalmente pues en la frontera norte con Estados Unidos, en la frontera sur con Guatemala y también estamos en otras ciudades a lo largo de la ruta migratoria. Me gustaría mencionar que los flujos migratorios en la región actualmente están dominados por el éxodo desde Centroamérica. Y estos flujos pues han aumentado en los últimos años y seguramente también van a aumentar aún más este año. Y yo creo que este aumento se debe pues a varios factores como los problemas de seguridad preexistentes y sobre todo también por la crisis económica causada por la pandemia COVID-19 y también por la destrucción causada por los recientes huracanes que hubo en Centroamérica. Me gustaría hablarles sobre el perfil de las personas que llegan a Asylum Access México y a quienes les brindamos nuestros servicios. Los perfiles que llegan a México pues son muy diversos, como les comentaba, vienen por flujos migratorios y estos flujos migratorios son mixtos. Entonces, hay personas que vienen huyendo de la violencia de las pandillas, vienen menores de edad no acompañados, víctimas de violencia basada en género y también encontramos migrantes económicos dentro de estos flujos. De esa manera, desde Asylum Access ayudamos a los refugiados a que puedan acceder a sus derechos a través de nuestros servicios legales. Todos los días nuestro equipo visita casas del migrante para brindarles información sobre sus derechos en México. Y por lo tanto, cada año hemos apoyado o brindado atención a más de 8,000 personas. También desde Asylum Access México llevamos a cabo diversas acciones a través de la incidencia política para visibilizar las violaciones a los derechos humanos. Y bueno, pues principalmente para exigir la liberación inmediata a las autoridades y esto pues lo hacemos a través de demandas, a través de quejas ante las comisiones de derechos humanos. También hemos participado ante la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Por ejemplo, me gustaría platicarles sobre una audiencia temática en la que participamos en el mes de diciembre de 2020, pero esta audiencia fue en conjunto con Casas del Migrante y organizaciones de la sociedad civil que están en Honduras, El Salvador y Guatemala. Y pues esto fue también para visibilizar las violaciones a los derechos humanos de las personas en estos 4 países, pero sobre todo derivados de la imposición de las políticas por el gobierno de Trump. También es muy importante mencionarles que la detención de personas migrantes y refugiadas en México es una práctica muy común. Pues México, bueno, ha firmado y ratificado muchísimas convenciones internacionales y estas convenciones pues establecen que la detención debería de ser el último recurso. Sin embargo, pues hemos reiterado en diferentes ocasiones que en México pues esta no es una excepción, la detención, siempre ha sido una regla. Y también me gustaría comentarles que creo que en México actualmente somos una de las pocas organizaciones que tenemos acceso a los centros de detención de personas migrantes. ¿Y qué hacemos cuando vamos a estos centros de detención? Pues bueno, supervisar las condiciones en las que se encuentran las personas, pero también ayudarles a conseguir la liberación y sobre todo informarles sobre su derecho a solicitar asilo, ya que constantemente vemos que esta información no se les da o se les da de manera errónea y también son intimidadas por las autoridades de migración para que no soliciten la condición de refugiado. En los últimos años también nos hemos enfocado junto con otras organizaciones para erradicar la detención de la niñez. Hemos trabajado con muchas organizaciones por más de 4 años, pues justo para poder lograr esto. También desde el Consejo Ciudadano del Instituto Nacional de Migración hemos impulsado este tema y para quienes no sepan qué es el Consejo Ciudadano, me gustaría comentarles rápidamente que es un órgano de participación ciudadana que a través del diálogo y retroalimentación relativa a la política migratoria de México contribuye a orientar las acciones del Instituto Nacional de Migración. Y pues bueno, como lo mencionaron al inicio, soy miembro del Consejo desde 2016. A partir de estos esfuerzos en conjunto con otras organizaciones y como les mencionaba, después de más de 4 años de lucha, pues me alegra mucho compartirles que finalmente en septiembre de 2020 el gobierno mexicano prohibió la detención de la niñez migrante, y esto a través de reformas y de armonización de la ley de migración y la ley de refugiados con la ley general de niñez. A pesar de que ya tenemos esta reforma en la ley, seguimos enfrentando muchos retos y pues bueno, ahora tenemos que supervisar cómo se está implementando esta reforma. Nos toca dar seguimiento y ver cómo se está haciendo. Y bueno, por último, también me gustaría mencionarles que las personas solicitantes de asilo y refugiadas en México enfrentan muchos obstáculos sociales y económicos para poder acceder a sus derechos, y principalmente educación, trabajo, salud, vivienda y seguridad. Además de que también hay muchas barreras para la integración. Una de estas barreras pues es también la falta de reconocimiento de los documentos que ellos tienen como documentos de identidad, y las autoridades no los reconocen como documentos oficiales. También los empleadores y los bancos tampoco reconocen estos documentos, y también son víctimas de discriminación para el acceso al empleo. Y pues en este sentido, tenemos un proyecto dentro de Asylum Access que se llama Ruta de Hospitalidad. Desde este proyecto de la Ruta de Hospitalidad, se les ayuda a las personas a encontrar trabajo, oportunidades de empleo y también otras oportunidades para que puedan acceder a servicios de salud y educación. Y principalmente bajo este proyecto abogamos por mejoras en el acceso y calidad de sus derechos. Gracias.
Thanks, Ale. And we were so thrilled, those of us in other parts of the world working with Asylum Access, so thrilled with the Mexican government's decision to stop the detention of children. That really, it was a wonderful victory through the work of Asylum Access Mexico and the other organizations that we've worked with there. You know, we've talked a little bit about the problems in Mexico and the challenges and how Asylum Access Mexico is addressing them. Dan, let's turn to the other side of the border. Can you talk about, can you give us an overview of the Trump administration's asylum policies, and then also how those policies have changed, or what policies have been changed so far under the Biden administration?
Sure, thank you, Emily. So over 4 years of the Trump administration, what we saw was a really concerted, deliberate effort to shut down the US-Mexico border to asylum seekers. And this was paired with a curtailment of refugee resettlement, which really was an all-out attack on allowing refugees to enter the United States. And I have to say the Trump administration was very successful, at least in this shutting down the US border to asylum seekers, particularly between 2018 and 2020, through 3 policies that I'm going to discuss in detail. It became nearly impossible for an asylum seeker to show up at the US-Mexico border and request protection and request refugee status. And this is important because it impacts the most vulnerable people. As you mentioned, Emily, you know, most refugees are in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and it's really only a very select few number of refugees who are able to enter the United States on an airplane, either through resettlement or by, you know, getting a visa and a passport and coming in and seeking asylum there. So by closing down the US-Mexico border to asylum seekers, the Trump administration essentially made it impossible for many, many of the most vulnerable people who were fleeing for their lives to receive any kind of protection in the United States. Now, I don't want to get too into the weeds. There were dozens and dozens of policy changes in legal interpretations, executive actions that had negative impacts on both refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in general over the past 4 years. But the 3 policies that we saw that had by far the largest impact by numbers, and certainly an enormous humanitarian cost, were the policies of metering, MPP, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, and Title 42. So I'm going to discuss each one of those a little bit, and I'll try not to get too into the weeds here. So the first policy that the Trump administration enacted to curtail asylum petitions at the border was called metering. And this was around the time that President Trump was saying, the US is full, we can't accept any more people, we can't accept any more asylum seekers. And what the administration did was essentially order Customs and Border Protection to determine on an individual basis each day how many asylum seekers they were going to let in. So before metering, under US law, and still under US law, if somebody shows up at the border and says, my life is in danger, I need protection, they don't have to be granted refugee status, but the US has an obligation to at least evaluate their claims, to at least understand if we send this person back either to Mexico or to some other country, is she going to be tortured? Is she going to be persecuted? What metering did was establish a very small number of people who could actually make that claim every day. And it was up to the discretion of the local CBP office to determine what that number was. And that was basically the extent of the US's role in metering. The Tijuana or the San Isidro Border Protection Agency would say, we're going to let 7 people in today, and it's up to you guys to figure out who those 7 are. So what happened was individual groups of asylum seekers organized themselves to make this list to determine who would be the lucky 7 on any given day. And it was literally like a paper notebook that you would get in CVS that a group of volunteer asylum seekers would set up on a card table at the port of entry. And anybody who would show up new to Tijuana or to wherever the border city was would put their name on the list. And when the asylum seekers got the number for the day, they would post how many people would be able to go in and just run down the list. So it was it was an unofficial system. It was ad hoc in the view of many, many advocates. It was illegal, but it had a major impact on who could come into the United States to seek refugee status, to seek international protection. And this policy, it affected tens of thousands of people, and people were often on these lists for months on end. And this policy, unfortunately, is still in place. The Biden administration during the campaign had promised to end the metering practice. But as of now, there are still about 16,000 people on these metering lists across the US-Mexico border. Many have been waiting for more than a year now, some for like 2 years. And it's had a huge impact on the ability for asylum seekers to receive protection in the US. So the advocacy community was aghast at this and thought, how could things get any worse? And then in January of 2019, the Trump administration announced the Migrant Protection Protocols, which is sometimes referred to as Remain in Mexico. What this program was, and Emily alluded to it in the story about Hector, is once somebody is actually able to present themselves to a US authority and say, my life is in danger, I'm being persecuted, I need protection in the United States, they would be given a court date, which could be 3 months away or 6 months away. And then they were sent back to Mexico until their court date came up. So this was a huge change from refugee law in the United States, basically since we've had a refugee law. It has always been the law and the practice of the United States that when somebody comes to our soil and says, I can't go back to where I came from, there's an obligation to understand the reasons that person can't return, to make an inquiry, to demand evidence, and the evidence is very strict. The demands are very strict, what you have to show. But throughout the whole process, these people who are seeking protection in the United States have traditionally been allowed to remain in the United States. Sometimes that's in migrant detention, which is extremely problematic, but at least these people are under the authority of the United States, and the US has recognized its obligation to protect anybody who asks for this protection until a determination is made that they don't need that protection anymore. What MPP did was send 70,000 people back to Mexico, and back to the most dangerous parts of Mexico along the northern border. The policy was eventually enacted throughout ports of entry across the US-Mexico border. And there was almost no infrastructure in Mexico for the people who were returned under MPP. So imagine being an asylum seeker, making an often harrowing journey to get to the US border and saying, I need you to help me, I need protection, I can't go back to where I came from. And being sent back to somewhere like Matamoros or Nuevo Laredo. These are some of the most dangerous cities in the world. And predictably, and what all the advocates said would happen, did happen, many of these asylum seekers were targeted for both crimes of opportunity and organized crime. So the cartels that control a lot of the territory on the US-Mexico border realized that many of the asylum seekers have family in the United States, that they had nobody to protect them in Mexico, and that if they kidnapped the people being sent back under MPP, they could extort their families in the United States for significant amounts of money. And Human Rights First has documented more than 1,500 cases of serious crimes against people returned under MPP. There are stories every day of kidnapping, of people being sent back under MPP. I'd recommend today a story was published in Vice News about a Cuban asylum seeker who fled political persecution in Cuba, made an incredible journey all the way across South America, across the Darien Gap, which is like the wildest place in the Americas, made his way to the United States, was sent back under MPP and was immediately kidnapped. And there's an actual video of this person held hostage by kidnappers, by drug cartels. And this isn't an isolated case. This was just the practice under MPP. Thankfully, the Biden administration both committed to ending MPP on day one and to some extent followed through with that promise. On the first day in office, the Biden administration announced there would be no new MPP enrollments. So anybody who seeks asylum at the US border right now, there are a bunch of other restrictions, but they will not be placed into MPP. And over the past month, the administration has been gradually unwinding MPP for about 25,000 people who have open cases. So every day, the administration is allowing in between 50 and 100 people. So it's slow. It's not happening quickly. Like I said, 70,000 people were affected by this, but they have managed to bring in about 1,000 people into the United States. And they're not granting them refugee status or anything like that. But the administration is allowing people to remain in the United States, which has always been the practice and the law until their cases are ready to be heard. So that is very good. What we haven't seen yet is any response for the 40,000 people who either were deported under MPP in circumstances which can't be considered due process. Almost less than 1% had attorneys through these processes, and it's very hard to get an attorney if you live in Ciudad Juarez, or it's very hard to get a US attorney who's able to cross the border to these dangerous areas and provide competent representation. So many people were deported without attorneys. Many thousands of people were deported in absentia, meaning they didn't show up for their hearing, and they may not have shown up for their hearing because they were kidnapped on the day of their hearing. But it doesn't matter. If the judge orders you deported, you have an order of removal, and there's no answer for what's going to happen to those people. And many other people, like Hector and other clients of ours, abandoned the process and either sought asylum in Mexico or living undocumented in Mexico or returned to their home countries. So we really are pushing the administration to find solutions for everyone who was impacted by MPP, not just the 25,000 people with open cases. And then finally, the last policy got probably a little bit less attention than the first two, to the extent that those got the attention, but has had an enormous impact on both asylum seekers and other migrants. So under Title 42 of the United States Code, the Centers for Disease Control has authority to restrict immigration when it's needed for public health during a global pandemic, for example. So in March of 2020, the Trump administration's CDC issued an order under Title 42 that basically closed down the border to anybody who doesn't have a visa. And that includes almost all refugees, asylum seekers, people fleeing persecution. And this has impacted more than 400,000 people since they implemented it in March. And what the policy says is if somebody is apprehended by border authorities, they can be sent back almost immediately with no inspection of their need for protection or of their needs in general. It's just summary expulsion, either to Mexico or to their countries of origin. They should, under an agreement with Mexico, only Central Americans and Mexicans should be sent back under Title 42, although we've seen cases of other nationalities being sent to Mexico. And unfortunately, this policy is also still in place. So while I mentioned that MPP is no longer in place and an asylum seeker wouldn't be placed in MPP if they crossed the border and asked for asylum, it's really not an option for anyone right now, or very few people, because Title 42 is so expansive that basically anybody who crosses the border and says, I need protection, I'm going to be murdered in my home country if you send me back, it can be expelled under Title 42. There should be an exception for people who are fleeing torture, but there are very high bars to prove that, and it has to be brought up by the person who is alleging torture. So there's no obligation for the government to ask, are you afraid of being tortured? This policy is still in place. It's impacting people every day. And importantly, all three of these policies violate probably the most fundamental principle in international refugee law, which is the principle of non-refoulement, which is a fancy French word of saying not sending people back to danger. So after World War II, the global community recognized that it is an international obligation of every country not to send somebody back to a country where they are likely to face torture or persecution. That is an absolute obligation for every country. And all three of these policies violate the principle of non-refoulement because they've resulted in thousands of people being sent back to danger, both in Mexico and through chain deportation to countries of origin where they face persecution. And as Alejandra will explain, these policies have also had a huge impact on Mexico and Mexico's asylum system.
Thank you, Dan. This is complicated stuff, all the different policies, understanding which policies existed and when and how they're changing. If you have questions, I really encourage you to use the Q&A function down next to the chat and go ahead and ask your questions. Don't be shy. It is complicated, so if you didn't get it all, feel free to ask. And you know, if this is complicated for us listening today, imagine how complicated it is for people like Hector, or for that matter, for someone like Hector, but who is only 15. Almost half of the world's refugees are children. So you can see why the work of Asylum Access Mexico is so important. You know, Ale, I'd like to take up Dan's question now. There have been so many new policies. It is so confusing. Over the past 4 years, it's been confusing. Can you tell us more about what effect Trump's policies had on people seeking asylum in Mexico?
Sí, claro. Pues desafortunadamente estas políticas han sido devastadoras, han sido trágicas para las personas que buscan seguridad. Pero primero me gustaría dar algunos antecedentes sobre cómo ha ido cambiando la política migratoria durante estos 4 años del gobierno de Trump y sobre todo en estos últimos 2 de 2019 y 2020. Primero me gustaría recordar que en la administración de Trump, en México estaba el gobierno de Enrique Peña Nieto, que terminó en 2018. Y el actual presidente, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, durante su campaña como candidato a la presidencia, pues hablaba mucho sobre cómo iba a garantizar los derechos de las personas migrantes, los derechos de las personas más vulnerables. Y pues bueno, desde las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, pues nos emocionaba escuchar eso en su campaña porque nos daba un mensaje esperanzador y pues veíamos que finalmente iban a haber cambios positivos para las personas. Y pues bueno, estábamos muy emocionados. Sin embargo, pues esto solo quedó en el discurso político y promesas de campaña, porque inmediatamente en cuanto asumió el poder, vimos un endurecimiento de la política migratoria en México, pero sobre todo esto, pues debido a la presión y a las amenazas de los Estados Unidos. Para las organizaciones que trabajamos con personas migrantes y refugiadas, nos resultó muy alarmante que en aras de impedir que Estados Unidos pusiera aranceles a México, pues la política migratoria del gobierno mexicano se tornara hostil contra las personas migrantes y refugiadas, y pues que se negociara bajo la premisa de favorecer intereses que lesionaran los derechos humanos. Y pues prácticamente se utilizó a las personas migrantes y refugiadas como moneda de cambio, y esto pues fue muy triste y muy lamentable. Y bueno, esto también en respuesta a las presiones del gobierno de Trump, vimos en junio de 2019 cómo México envía a más de 6,000 elementos de la Guardia Nacional a la frontera sur de México para contener los flujos migratorios. Y pues bueno, todas estas personas que componen la Guardia Nacional pues no están capacitados para identificar personas que requieren protección internacional, personas que podrían ser reconocidas como refugiadas. Vimos cómo la Guardia Mexicana fue desplegada contra estas personas que vienen huyendo de su país y que están buscando asilo a través de esta militarización. Se incrementaron pues las detenciones, veíamos muchísimo cómo había deportaciones masivas, muchísimas detenciones, las estaciones migratorias hacinadas, y pues bueno, todo esto, como lo mencionaba, sin que las autoridades identificaran quiénes estaban en riesgo en caso de ser devueltas a su país de origen, y pues sobre todo violando el principio de no devolución, que lo tenemos pues en la Ley de Refugiados y en la Convención de 1951. Y por otra parte también hemos visto cómo el problema de protección en México pues es mucha falta de voluntad política para garantizar los derechos humanos de las personas refugiadas. La política migratoria en México, como lo he mencionado, se basa en detección, detención y deportación. Y pues bueno, esta tendencia se agravó sobre todo en los últimos años por las presiones del gobierno de Trump. Y como lo mencionaba, pues esta política migratoria se ha producido sobre todo en el rechazo en fronteras y en el rechazo también de personas migrantes en los aeropuertos. Tenemos muchos casos documentados que cuando una persona llega a un aeropuerto y quiere solicitar la condición de refugiado, el agente migratorio en México le dice: no, eso no existe en México, aquí no hay eso y no está ese procedimiento. Entonces, las autoridades siguen sin verificar cuáles son sus necesidades de protección, sin verificar si su vida está en riesgo. Y también es importante mencionar que la detención de estas personas o la detención de las personas migrantes se duplicó en los últimos años, y el 87% de las personas detenidas son deportadas por falta de información, pero sobre todo también pues por falta de acceso a mecanismos de protección. La detención de las personas se prolonga, no hay un límite efectivo, por ejemplo, para el tiempo de detención, es como muy variable o muy incierto cuánto tiempo puede estar una persona solicitante de asilo en detención. Me gustaría mencionar que, bueno, en 2017 se puso en marcha un programa sobre alternativas a la detención. Este programa, pues, en conjunto con ayuda del ACNUR, pero actualmente este programa solo beneficia a una parte de las personas. ¿Por qué solo beneficia ahora a una parte? Pues porque en octubre de 2020 el Instituto Nacional de Migración emitió un oficio en el cual hace este programa más restrictivo, y muy pocas personas pueden beneficiarse de este programa. Sobre todo refiere, por ejemplo, quienes son personas que vienen viajando solas y que entraron a México de manera irregular, no pueden beneficiarse de este programa. Y es muy grave porque hay una contradicción, ya que la Ley de Refugiados pues nos dice que no debe de haber una sanción por ingreso irregular. Entonces, pues bueno, esto está ocurriendo. Pero también me gustaría recordar un poco sobre todo cómo estas políticas de Trump afectaron también en la frontera sur. Un cambio también que hubo en la práctica pues era que las personas ya no podían moverse libremente de un lado a otro. Hubo amenazas contra las empresas privadas de transporte para que no prestaran sus servicios a las personas migrantes. Y también hubo muchas amenazas a activistas de los derechos humanos de las personas migrantes y solicitantes de asilo. Y pues bueno, también otro resultado que ha sido de estas políticas por Trump, pues ha sido sobre todo que ha habido un incremento de las solicitudes de asilo en México. Se cuadruplicaron en muy poco tiempo. Bueno, y a partir de 2017 se empezaron a incrementar las solicitudes y en 2019 vemos que hubo más de 70,000 solicitudes de asilo. En 2020 hay un poco menos, hay alrededor de 40,000 solicitudes, pero eso también tiene que ver con la pandemia por el COVID-19. Y por último, me gustaría también mencionar que otra falta de voluntad política que hay en México para proteger a las personas refugiadas, pues es que la Agencia Mexicana para los Refugiados carece de personal y de fondos. Y pues esto también, el que no tenga el suficiente personal, el que no tenga suficiente presupuesto, pues ha provocado que haya un retraso en muchísimas solicitudes de asilo, en más de 80,000 solicitudes de asilo. Y también es muy importante mencionar que el plazo para que una persona pueda obtener un resultado de si fue o no reconocida como refugiada es de 45 días hábiles, pero con este incremento de solicitudes de asilo, las personas están esperando hasta pues más de 6 meses y más de un año. Estas han sido pues prácticamente algunas de las principales afectaciones que han tenido las personas en México por estas políticas de Trump.
Thank you, Ale. Yeah, it sounds like it's certainly had a negative impact. And I remember when the threat of tariffs was first raised by the Trump administration and how we were worried about the impacts that might have on Mexico. And unfortunately, we saw it come to fruition in all of these negative ways that you've talked about. Thinking about how the US asylum system and the Mexican asylum system work together and how the policies of both the Mexican administration and the US administration can intersect or exert pressures on each other. I think some people may be confused about why would someone seek asylum in the US versus Mexico? Why would someone seek asylum in Mexico versus the US? Dan, can you talk a little bit about why it's important for both the US and Mexico to have strong asylum systems in a context where each country influences the other?
Sure, that's a great question, Emily. So, the refugee rights community and people working in international refugee issues talk about a concept of shared responsibility. So, 147 countries have ratified the Refugee Convention or its protocol, including both the United States and Mexico. And this means each one of those countries has assumed a responsibility to protect anybody who comes within its borders and asks for refugee status or asks for asylum protection. Now, we also recognize that while there's the shared responsibility among governments, refugees have agency and they are able to, or they should be able to decide where they're going to be best able to rebuild their lives. And for some refugees, for some asylum seekers, Mexico provides a lot of opportunities. So we have plenty of client success stories of people who have come to Mexico, have fled their countries, have sought protection in Mexico, have received refugee status, and are now well along in the process of rebuilding their lives, starting businesses, finding jobs, re-enrolling in schools to finish their studies. So Mexico does have a lot of opportunity, and it is a large country. It's a middle-income country. The economic opportunities are different in different states. But for some people, Mexico is a good option. That said, there are a lot of challenges within Mexico for people who are seeking refugee status. Everything that Ale just mentioned: detention, deportation, the long wait times in Mexico for a decision can be real barriers to asylum seekers. And beyond that, some of the dangers that I discussed earlier make it impossible for somebody who is fleeing persecution or torture or other things in their home country to make a new home in Mexico. We have clients who are fleeing gang violence in Guatemala or Honduras. They show up in Tenosique, which is one of our offices in southern Mexico. And during the process of seeking refugee status, they see the exact same people who they fled from. They see the same gangs. And some of these gangs have presence throughout Mexico. We have clients who are fleeing sexual and gender-based violence, and they come to Mexico and they realize that Mexico has extremely high incidences of violence against women. I mean, this has been a huge issue in the Mexican news just this week. There was a massive protest at the presidential palace because of the rate of femicide within Mexico. So for some people, it's going to be very challenging to find the kind of protection that they need in Mexico, and they certainly ought to have the ability to go to the United States and seek protection there. There are also some really important differences between Mexican law and the United States law regarding refugees that may make Mexico a better option for certain populations. In the US, if you want to be recognized as a refugee, not only do you have to prove that you have a fear of persecution, a well-founded fear of persecution, that you're in danger in your home country, but that persecution is on account of one of five very specific reasons. So you're being persecuted because of your race, or because of your religion or nationality, or because of your political opinion, or because you're a member of a very specific social group. So if somebody's just fleeing a generally violent situation, or the breakdown of social order in their home country, that's not necessarily enough to win an asylum case in the US. There are plenty of good immigration lawyers who are able to win those cases, but for some people, it's just going to be very difficult to win asylum based on facts that don't have any individual persecution. Now, Mexico has recognized that many people cannot be safe in their country just because a civil war is happening, even though they weren't necessarily individually persecuted, or because there is general violence in the country, or because there are massive human rights violations. And Mexico has adopted a much broader definition of who's a refugee into its laws, relying on what's called the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees, which basically says anybody fleeing generalized violence can be recognized as a refugee. And Mexico has recognized that in Honduras, El Salvador, and Venezuela, those are three countries that are characterized by either generalized violence or massive human rights violations, and has made just has made a determination that people fleeing that kind of violence should be protected in Mexico. And you see with the approval rates for asylum seekers, for example, from Honduras and El Salvador last year, were above 80% in Mexico. If you compare that to the United States, Central American claims last fiscal year were approved at about 15%. And there are some immigration courts, you don't get to choose which court your case is going to be heard at, where the approval rate's below around 1%. So some people are going to have a much greater chance of success in Mexico if they can find a situation where they are safe, where they have access to all of the rights that we help fight for. So access to work and to school and to healthcare. So those are some of the reasons people may seek asylum in Mexico rather than the US, and vice versa. Some of the reasons why people are unable to find an effective protection in Mexico and should and need to be able to seek asylum in the United States.
Thanks, Dan. Ale, I'm going to direct my last question to you, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So again, please take the opportunity to put your questions into the Q&A function. While folks are doing that, Ale, can you tell us a little bit about Asylum Access Mexico's current priorities? Given the recent changes, given the new administration in the US, what are you pushing for in Mexico right now?
Sí, claro que sí. Pues tenemos muchas prioridades, pero también tenemos muchos retos. Entonces, me gustaría mencionar alguno de ellos. Creo que, bueno, como primer punto necesitamos la cooperación regional para garantizar que los derechos de las personas solicitantes de asilo y refugiados pues se materialicen. En el discurso político, pues bueno, el gobierno mexicano afirma estar muy comprometido con garantizar los derechos humanos de las personas solicitantes de asilo y refugiadas. Como mencionaba hace un momento también, ha ratificado muchos tratados internacionales de derechos humanos, pero sin embargo, pues esto nada más no lo vemos que se realice. En la práctica sus acciones no se guían por sus compromisos en materia de derechos humanos. Entonces, pues creo que debemos seguir trabajando a nivel regional para que los gobiernos dejen de militarizar sus fronteras. Anteriormente, hace unos años en Centroamérica no había detención de personas y ahora pues las vemos también estas fronteras militarizadas. Entonces, tenemos que seguir trabajando para eso. En el caso de México, pues vemos también que esta militarización o esta política migratoria que tenemos actualmente, pues ha sido ejercida por varios gobiernos estadounidenses, pero principalmente por el gobierno de Trump. Y también, bueno, pues considero que estos recursos de la militarización y el control fronterizo se deben de reasignar a las agencias de refugiados y a los programas de integración para las personas refugiadas. Pero también para otras causas, ¿no? Que originan que las personas salgan de sus países de origen, como por ejemplo, pues, erradicar la violencia de las pandillas en Centroamérica, la inseguridad, la corrupción, entre otras. Por otra parte, también creo que debemos seguir incidiendo en que se mejore la identificación de las personas que requieren protección internacional en los puntos de entrada y que se garantice pues, el acceso al asilo a las personas. Y aquí es muy importante mencionarles que actualmente estamos trabajando con Comar en un protocolo para identificar a las personas con necesidades de protección internacional. Y esto pues es a raíz de una recomendación del Consejo de Derechos Humanos de la ONU en el examen del periódico Universal en México en 2019. Y pues para que esta identificación de las personas sea efectiva, pues se debe capacitar a todos los servidores públicos que están en puntos de entrada, tanto en fronteras como en aeropuertos. Entonces, esto es muy importante porque deben de conocer sus responsabilidades y remitir a tiempo a las personas que requieren solicitar asilo. Y pues bueno, es una de las prioridades importantes. Por otra parte, también se debe formalizar el programa de alternativas a la detención. Como yo les comentaba, este programa pues se aplica desde 2017 a personas adultas también, y pues era un programa muy efectivo porque permite a las personas solicitantes de asilo continuar sus procedimientos fuera de las estaciones migratorias, les da la oportunidad de trabajar, de que sus hijos estudien, y pues bueno, esto ayuda también a facilitar la integración local. Pero como les mencioné, actualmente o recientemente Migración ha puesto medidas restrictivas y pues necesitamos que este programa quede establecido en la ley, que se haga una reforma a la ley de refugiados y entonces ya tenga que ser una obligación para el Instituto Nacional de Migración de no detener a las personas y ya no sea a discreción de ellos solamente. Por otra parte, también como les mencionaba, pues el sistema de asilo en México necesita ser reforzado y actualizado para poder satisfacer todas las demandas que hay actualmente. La Comar, pues se ha ampliado en algunos años, ha tenido presencia en otras ciudades donde no las tenía antes, pero es necesario que siga teniendo presencia en otros estados donde no está y que hay un número considerable de personas que requieren solicitar la condición de refugiado. Entonces, pues es importante también que se amplíe la presencia de la Comar y como lo mencionaba anteriormente, sobre todo en puntos de internación y en aeropuertos. También pues esto va de la mano, ¿no? En que necesita un aumento del presupuesto la Comar. Este aumento debe ser muy significativo para que puedan contratar más personas, pero también es muy importante que la Comar pueda contar con un sistema electrónico para que las personas que están en un procedimiento pues puedan verificar su estado en el que se encuentra su proceso en línea, porque pues ahora también con la saturación de trámites, con las condiciones del COVID, pues es muy complicado que las personas puedan acceder a tener una actualización sobre su caso, y creo que este sistema electrónico les podría ayudar mucho y no les generaría esa incertidumbre que actualmente les genera por no saber en qué situación están, qué va a pasar con su caso. Por otra parte, también es muy importante, y bueno, esto ya para cerrar, por último, pero no por último menos importante, creo que en materia de integración y acceso a derechos, ahora también es una prioridad que las personas solicitantes de asilo y refugiadas sean incorporadas en los planes de vacunación por el COVID-19. Pues hemos visto también, por ejemplo, ahora que se inició el programa de vacunación en México, cómo en Ciudad de México ha habido algunos mensajes discriminatorios diciendo que no se va a vacunar a personas extranjeras. Y esto es muy grave porque solo a través de la inclusión de toda la población en las medidas sanitarias, sin discriminación, sin nacionalidad, sin importar el estatus migratorio, la región va a poder superar esta crisis de salud pública. Esta crisis de salud pública pues es una crisis global. Y como lo hemos mencionado en diversas ocasiones, el COVID no te pide un pasaporte. Gracias.
Thank you, Ale. And I appreciate your taking us through the priorities. And I just want to add one point on Mexico's refugee agency, COMAR. Its budget, Ale talked about the importance of having a greater budget for it. But what she didn't say is that the number of asylum seekers in Mexico has grown from about 3,000 in 2015 to about 70 or 80,000 today. So the budget has hardly increased in that time. And so you can see how that is a huge problem. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa for some question and answer from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily and Ale and Dan. We have some awesome questions. I'm going to do my best to get to all of them. So this first question, I think, Ale, this question will go to you. Are asylum seekers allowed to work in Mexico while awaiting their asylum application? And also, do asylum seekers get access to government services in Mexico?
Sí, gracias. Esta pregunta es muy importante porque, de acuerdo a la ley de migración, las personas solicitantes de asilo tienen el derecho a tener acceso a un documento de estancia por razones humanitarias mientras esperan sus resoluciones por parte de la COMAR. Este documento de estancia por razones humanitarias es un documento migratorio temporal que les permite trabajar. Entonces, sí deberían de tener acceso las personas solicitantes de asilo a este documento migratorio que les permita trabajar.
Great. Next question. Are Asylum Access staff allowed uninhibited access to migrants on both sides of the US-Mexico border? Perhaps Dan or Ale?
We have, I wouldn't say uninhibited access to asylum seekers in Mexico, but we do have permission from the migration authorities to enter the detention centers in each of the areas where we have offices, which is, I mean, migration detention would be the only place in Mexico where we wouldn't necessarily have access to an asylum seeker. And we're only able to access the detention centers where we have offices, and that access, while it is generally provided, is not universally provided. We have had instances in getting into migration detention centers for various reasons, but generally we do have access to asylum seekers in Mexico. We do not do, like our attorneys are, with the exception of me, are all Mexican attorneys. So we don't really represent any asylum seekers once they're in the United States. So we don't have access. I mean, we don't try to access asylum seekers in the United States.
Okay, the next question, I like this one, has to do with UNHCR, also known as the UN Refugee Agency. Can you explain to us the role of the UNHCR in making sure that international principles, such as non-refoulement, which Dan talked about before, are respected? Maybe Ale?
Sí, claro. Pues el ACNUR brinda asistencia técnica al gobierno para fortalecer los procedimientos que llevan. Y pues bueno, puedo mencionar también que somos socios del ACNUR y el ACNUR también está dentro de las comunidades donde tenemos oficinas y nos canaliza casos. Por ejemplo, puedo mencionar también que el ACNUR tiene acceso a estaciones migratorias, puede identificar personas que requieren protección internacional y también son canalizadas para que podamos brindar nuestros servicios a estas personas que identifican.
So this next question, I think should go to you, Dan. What possible scenarios do you see for an end to that system of metering?
I mean, the Biden administration committed to ending metering. I think there may not be too much pressure about ending metering right now, because while Title 42 is in place, it doesn't really matter. Nobody's coming in. What we and our allies are really advocating for right now is an end of Title 42, because that's the main barrier to entering the United States. But of course, if Title 42 were to end, we would certainly also call on the administration to end metering. And I should point out, I forgot to mention when I was talking about Title 42, it's presented as a public health measure, but many public health experts have explained that it's not doing anything for public health, because while the US-Mexico border is largely closed to asylum seekers, it's still largely open. If you want to go to Cancun for the weekend and come back to the US, you can do that without really any restriction. And there's tons of trade and travel and work and kids going to school and lots of, there are hundreds of thousands of people crossing the US-Mexico border. So the limited number of asylum seekers who are excluded under Title 42 really do not have any impact on public health.
Now let's turn to the Mexican-Guatemalan border. We have a question. Someone is asking, can people cross through Tapachula right now? What is the situation at the southern border of Mexico? Maybe Ale, do you want to take that one?
Sí, pues las personas que requieren solicitar la condición de refugiado deberían de tener acceso al procedimiento desde la frontera, porque me gustaría mencionar que a partir de las medidas tomadas por las autoridades por el COVID-19, el procedimiento de asilo no se ha suspendido. Este procedimiento sigue. Entonces, si una persona está en un punto de internación, debería tener acceso al procedimiento. Asylum Access no estamos del lado de Tapachula, estamos del otro lado, estamos en la frontera del Ceibo con Guatemala y en Palenque, Chiapas. Pero pues sí, me gustaría mencionar que también hay otras organizaciones en Tapachula a quien pueden acercarse para que les pueda dar información y orientación sobre cómo solicitar la condición de refugiado desde ese punto de internación.
So now that Trump is out of office, do you think that we ought to expect a change in the immigration policies in Mexico? With the tariffs gone, surely there's no reason to continue with current policies. Do we expect a change? Either Ale or Dan.
Pues debería de haber un cambio. Es algo que estamos haciendo desde Asylum Access, a través de la incidencia, pues generar esos cambios en la política migratoria y que México no tenga una política migratoria pues justo impuesta por el gobierno de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Que pueda tener su propia política migratoria, pero que sea una política migratoria garantista de derechos humanos. Las personas mexicanas pues nos caracterizamos por ser hospitalarias, entonces que se demuestre eso, que México es un país hospitalario, pero además también México ha recibido a lo largo de su historia a muchas personas solicitantes de asilo. Lo vimos en los 80s con las personas guatemaltecas, en las épocas de las dictaduras. Entonces, esto tiene que seguir porque las personas mexicanas justo es lo que queremos que se siga visibilizando y pues eso, que sí se pueda cambiar esta política migratoria en México.
So this next question, I think, should go to you, Dan, and it's super important. The question is, how can Asylum Access address structural barriers that Black migrants face in navigating the asylum process, whether it be in Mexico or in the US?
Yes, thank you to whomever asked that question. That's a huge issue on both sides of the border. Black migrants are particularly vulnerable in both the Mexican asylum system and in the United States asylum system. And we see right now that many of the people who are excluded from even the benefits that the Biden administration has extended to, the small group of MPP, the Haitian community is largely excluded or is excluded from that. The Haitians weren't part of MPP. And there are many African migrants. We've seen the same thing in Mexico. While the alternative to detention program that Alejandra mentioned it was successful for some groups of people, Black migrants were largely excluded from the alternative to detention program, and many Black migrants spent a lot more time in detention, up to indefinite amounts of time in detention in Mexico, because for a variety of reasons. Mexico also does a fairly poor job of complying with its law that requires it to provide interpreters to anybody who needs it in the asylum system. So Haitian migrants, African migrants, indigenous migrants also. We have indigenous clients from Guatemala and from other places who don't speak Spanish. All of them are entitled to an interpreter and a process in a language that they understand, but are largely not given that access. So the question was, what can Asylum Access do? We are working and will continue to work to push the Mexican government to live up to its obligations. I mean, there's also a general non-discrimination obligation for all governments in everything that they do, and we file actions. We have a strategic litigation team that tries to identify areas where we can set precedent through the Mexican courts or through international courts to push the Mexican government to live up to these obligations, and we continue to do that. We work with CONAPRED, which is the Mexican organization that is charged with battling discrimination, with the National Human Rights Commission, with various other bodies within Mexico, and also in the Inter-American system and the UN system to try to address this problem. And we do all this in coalition with many other wonderful organizations.
Thanks, Dan. Ale, I'll direct this next question to you. How do your future clients find you? How does Asylum Access Mexico, advertise our services, if you will? How do people find us?
Pues sí, como les comentaba al inicio en la primera pregunta que me hizo Emily, bueno, tenemos 7 oficinas, estamos en Tenosique, Tabasco, en Villahermosa, en Palenque, Chiapas, Acayucan, Veracruz, Monterrey, Nuevo León, Tijuana, Baja California y en Ciudad de México. Entonces, donde tenemos, tanto en el sur como en el norte, hacemos visitas a las casas de migrantes para también identificar a personas que requieren protección internacional y que no han tenido conocimiento sobre este derecho. También tenemos las redes sociales, tenemos la página de Facebook donde nos pueden encontrar tanto a Asylum Access como el proyecto de la ruta de hospitalidad, y por Twitter también nos pueden encontrar. Actualmente, pues por la pandemia, muchas de nuestras seguimientos a casos y de las primeras citas pues se han agendado por medio de la página de Facebook. Estamos muy activos, más bien el equipo de Asylum Access está muy activo y les responde inmediatamente, y por ahí también pueden contactarnos.
So we're actually coming up on time, and I'm so sorry that we were not able to answer everyone's questions. I really appreciate how engaged everyone has been. Hopefully we'll be able to do a similar event that people can come to and we can answer more questions. I actually am going to answer the last question, if you guys don't mind. We do have an attendee who themselves might have a protection concern, specifically in the US. And I think it's really important to mention that I'm glad that you asked us this question. If there's anyone here who has a protection concern, please do email us at info@asylumaccess.org. We do not provide legal representation in the US, but we do have partners and we do know people that can help, and we can provide you with those resources. Certainly also, if you are in Mexico and you have a protection concern, please do reach out to our office in Mexico. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Shalini again to close.
Thanks, Lisa. And thanks to Ale, Dan, and Emily for providing such a wealth of information in such a short period of time. Thank you all for joining us. It's really important to remember that, yes, these policies are improving, but there's still so much work to be done to undo the Trump administration's assault on asylum and to help people who were affected by these policies. There are thousands of people seeking safety in Mexico and the US, and we must keep advocating for them. There's a lot you can do to help. Please follow us on social media and sign up for our updates to stay informed. You can check the position of your representative in the US or Mexico. You can also support advocacy organizations on both sides of the border. And we really hope to see you at another event soon. Good night, everyone.